This video works with or works as an introduction to the English Language Paper 2 Section A, the reading section, which is almost a twin to the English Language Paper 1 that you studied previously. The slides are designed to work with the Aberfan practice paper, which you should all have from the email which I sent out on Sunday. So let me talk through then how this will work. So first of all, the resources that you have, you've got the insert with the actual two texts on it, the question booklet as well, and obviously the video which you're listening to now. The essential thing for you to print or get hold of if you can is the insert, and if you can also these PowerPoint slides, which you can then use to make notes on as you watch this video. Personally, I would also read the insert text very carefully before you start. If you haven't already done that, I would stop and do so now, because it will be useful when you come to do the questions. This video breaks it down into the 4 questions and gives you some instructions for how to do each one. It also shows you the top band mark scheme, and it also shows you an example paragraph from an actual student answer. And then when you've done that for each question, you'll need to pause to have a go then at your own answer for that question. So you'll see then the 4th bullet point here, it asks then you to have a go at each of the questions on the practice paper after you've watched the introduction for each one. I've copied these questions from the question paper into the slides to save you printing out the whole paper, although you could still print it out if you wish. Now, as if this is going to be your first attempt at a paper 2, don't worry about having a go at the answers in timed conditions. If you do it in timed conditions, all that you'll find is that your answers will be very brief, pointlessly brief. So for this, it's much more important if you spend as long as you need to produce the required amount for each question. When you have completed questions up to the end of question 4, if you can then email me your work for that, I'll get that marked and I'll return that to you with some feedback so that you can see whether or not you've got the right idea. Finally, it's very, very, very important that you keep all the work that you do on this together. I mean, obviously all of your work that you've been doing is important, but this particularly is essential, as this will be your introduction to this exam paper. So it's important that you keep all these slides, all these notes, all these practices together, logically ordered in one place. Okay? As we go through the presentation, I would definitely be highlighting or making notes as you go along, so that you've got as much information as you can, and those notes will hopefully be based on what I will be doing, or what I will be saying, which will be a combination of me talking over what it actually says here and me adding additional information as well. So, to move on. Briefly then, a reminder about the format of the paper. Well, you'll see here, like paper 1, this is 1 hour and 45 minutes long. Now, this is a non-fiction paper, which is to say that the text could be made up of things like newspaper articles, diary or journal entries, letters, these kinds of texts. Paper 1, in contrast, is a fiction paper, so it will always be from a novel or a short story, the extracts that you get for paper 1, but this is paper 2. Now, for this paper, there will also be 2 non-fiction extracts, rather than paper 1, which only has the 1 extract. For this there'll be 2, and for that reason, there is more of a focus on comparison than you would see with paper 1. Section A, quite similar to paper 1. You've got 4 reading questions, which get longer as the paper goes on, and progressively more difficult, and you spend about an hour on that. And then section B will be a writing question. Again, like the one for paper 1, it's one question only, but this time, rather than you being asked to write something creative, you'll be asked to write something like, for example, a blog post or a diary entry or a letter or something of that nature, a non-fiction text type. But I won't actually be talking about section B in this video. That will be something that I will cover later. So, to continue, let's think about question 1 first. Now, the first thing to say is that just like with question 1 on paper 1, is a very simple question. This is the question that is designed not to trip anybody up at all. We'll begin by reading the actual question format itself. So you'll see here, it will say, read again the first part of source A from lines 1 to 21. So clear instructions then for which text to look at and whereabouts in the text to find your answers. Now, as before, it's often a good idea to put a box around the area that you want to look at. And very simply, you have to choose 4 statements below which are true. It gives you a list of 8, so it's a multiple choice question. Now, moving to the notes on the left hand side of this screen, it's not a hard question, but there may be a few parts of it that might be a little bit tricksy, so it's important to read everything carefully. So, for example, and this is just an example, the first statement, A, says Aberfan was a well-known place in Wales. Now, the wording in the text might say something like Aberfan was not a well-known place in Wales. If you looked at that quickly, you might think that they were the same sentence, but actually, of course, that one word not would completely change the meaning of it. So this is what I mean when I say that it might be a little bit tricksy. It's important just to be careful. Now, you'll see my first tip. As you do it, I would first of all jot down your true or false answers somewhere other than in the boxes for the real answers. A good place to do it would be, as I've done on this demonstration here, next to the letters, and perhaps write down true or false or T or F. Work out what you think are the correct answers. It says don't fill in the answers until you are pretty sure. The reason for that I'll come on to in a moment. Now, one final note is the older exam papers that we may use for practices, and indeed this particular paper, don't have such clear instructions as these ones on the bullet points on the question, because these were actually changed in response to some students getting confused about the way the question was worded. So, for that reason, you'll see that the wording of this question on my slide here differs slightly from the one on the question paper if you've printed the question paper out. But anyway, that doesn't matter. The point is, when you do the real exam, it will be worded like this. So, let's now look carefully at the instructions for how to actually fill in this question. Because if you didn't follow these instructions, you would potentially lose all the marks just by not coding it in correctly. So if we look now at the 4 bullet points which give you instructions for how to answer the question. The first bullet point then says, shade in the circles in the boxes of the ones that you think are true. So you'll see the first box that I've filled in, I've shaded in that blank circle, or rather oval, in the middle of that box. If you make an error, i.e. you change your mind and you no longer wish to use that answer, then you cross out the whole box. And again, the second one that I've filled in, you'll see I've crossed out the whole box. If you change your mind again and you decide that you do after all want to use an answer which you've previously discounted, then you put a circle around the whole thing to show that actually that is the answer that you do want to count. But this is what I mean when I say it's important that you are clear in your mind which answers you want to choose, or as clear as possible in your mind which answers you want to choose before you go on to actually fill in the box. Because you can see, can't you, how it might start to get quite confusing for an examiner quite quickly if you've got various scrolls all around. Don't choose more than 4 statements. For the ones that you think are false, you leave blank. You don't have to do anything in those boxes at all. So quite straightforward once you get your head around it. Make sure you know how that should be answered. So, can you then now please have a go at this question for the Aberfan practice paper and then check them against the correct answers below? So the question's asking then about which four statements are true about that extract. If you can have a go at that then please, and when you've done that, on this slide here you'll see the answers for this question, so you can mark your own work. And I would pause, do that, and then mark it before continuing on with this presentation. And that's really it for question 1. It's quite straightforward, quite simple, as long as you know the simple rules of the question. So let's now move on to question 2. Now question 2, you'll see, is worth slightly more marks than question 1. It's worth 8 marks. The timing for this question, I would suggest perhaps about 12 minutes, something like that. A little bit more time. So what is this question about? This is a question that is slightly different, or is different from the sort of thing that you would see on question on paper 1. So this question then is asking you to compare the impact of factual differences between both sources, and I'll make it clear in a second what I mean by that. But there's a very important thing that you must know, you must remember, because it's a mistake that many people make. This question does not ask you anything about language, and you'll gain no marks whatsoever for talking about language in it or for using any language terms. You don't have to talk about similes or metaphors or nouns or anything like that. None of that. No marks for that whatsoever. Now, the best way to answer this question then is to start with a single sentence to summarize the difference between the two texts, and then 2 detailed PEE paragraphs will get you the marks. If you can manage 4, fine, but 2 minimum. You'll see exactly what I mean by that when I show you an example in a moment. But the way to set those paragraphs then out is, source A presents Aberfan as, make a point about what it's like, use evidence to back it up, and then explain what that shows. And that's where you'll pick the marks up. You're looking for what is called inference, reading between the lines skills here. So what the differences actually suggest. So look at how, for example, Aberfan is described and think about what that suggests. So write a paragraph about the first text and then simple discourse marker like, on the other hand, source B presents London as, and then repeat the same process. And if you can do that 4 times, great, 2 times minimum. Now, the important thing for this question is to get above half marks, you need to focus more on what we call inference. That is to say, what is suggested more than what is specifically said. And a good way to do that is to focus on the different atmosphere or mood of the 2 places. So instead of saying something like Aberfan is in the country, whereas London is in the city, if you talk about something like, Aberfan has a happy and cheerful atmosphere, which would be a lie, by the way, but you'll get the idea. This and about how that is created. As I say, we'll look at an example in a moment, but if we just read the question briefly, you need to refer to source A and source B for this question, emphasizing therefore that it's about comparison. Both sources give details about the places where the events occur. Use details from both sources to write a summary of the differences between Aberfan and London. Right, let's look a bit more about what that would actually look like. So first of all, if you think about the mark scheme, well, the first thing to say is if you follow the instructions on the previous slide, you'll meet all the criteria for a response scoring 7 or 8 out of 8, i.e. in the top band. Now notice, as I said before, that there is absolutely no reference, no marks are awarded for use of terms or reference to language. So, if we look at the criteria here then, in the skills descriptors column, the second column, it says then that you will show perceptive synthesis and interpretation of both texts. By synthesis, it means simply taking information and putting it into your own words, which is what the explanation is all about. So, let's look at what it says. Make perceptive inferences from both texts. This is where talking about mood or atmosphere is actually a really good approach, because it leads you away from just saying simple things like town versus country or whatever it might be. Makes judicious references or use of textual detail relevant to the focus of the question, i.e. Clustered quotations. Several brief quotations picking out patterns. And the statements, i.e. your points, show perceptive differences between the texts. But yes, I think definitely for this question, to lead each paragraph by talking about mood or atmosphere is absolutely the way to approach it. Let's look now at an example. So, apologies for the slight dodgy handwriting, but this is a real-world example. This scored 7 out of 8 overall. If the points had been a bit stronger, it would have gained 8 out of 8. We'll read it through, and then you can highlight how the student has used inference, i.e. looked at what these differences actually suggest, and then finally after that you can have a go at doing this for the Aberfan paper, because this example comes from a different exam paper. So let's read through this example paragraph. It says the moods created by the locations in the sources are different. This is what I mean when I say that that could actually have been a bit more profound. It could actually said something about how, for example, they're different. Alain de Botton, i.e. the first writer on that exam paper, describes his beach as being, quote, as quiet as a library with, and the quote, nature at her most benevolent. Two things there. So first of all, you'll see that there are two short quotations that have been integrated into the sentence. They've been carefully picked and put together. And finally, in the second quotation, notice where they've used the ellipsis, nature ... at her most benevolent. So again, if we're talking about sophisticated use of quotation, the fact that they've cut out a part that's irrelevant and just focused in on the bit that supports their point is very, very good. That's good to note. Anyway, the answer continues. These quotations create a sense of peace and prosperity, with the comparison of a library conveying how the area is for tourism and human enjoyment. So see how it's inferring, it's going beyond just the facts, and it's talking about what those facts suggest. You'll see then now it goes on to talk about the second text, and this is what I mean when I say sort of PEE and then PEE for the second text. In contrast to this, so again a clear discourse marker, a clear signpost signalling that it's moving on to compare, Mary Shelley, the writer of the second text, describes the river as gloomy beneath the precipices. Notice again the two short quotations, gloomy from precipices, and in view of, another quote, distant mountains. So once again, clusters of short, sharp, relevant quotations. These quotations create an image of a dark, sombre place far from civilization, unlike the beach that Alain de Botton described. So that's all we're looking at. What you've got there is 2 PEE paragraphs. Now, that's the absolute minimum. If you can do 4 of those, i.e. as much as you see on this slide again, then that would be a perfect answer for this question. So I suppose 2 to 4 paragraphs, or this or twice what you see here, would be the amount we're looking for. 4 PE paragraphs, 2 on each text, double this. So once you've done this, please highlight the inference as it asks you here, and then have a go at question 2 for the exam paper for Aberfan. When you've done that, now you can either use this before you start your answer or afterwards, depending on how confident you feel. You may have your own ideas, but alternatively, if you are stuck, you could use some of the points below to get your paragraph started. I won't read them out, but they're there for your inspiration. As I say, depending on, you can either use them before you answer it or after, depending on how confident you are. So go away, please, if you like. Do that answer for that question, and then when you've done that, the final thing is if you can then sort of self-assess that. So compare the work that you've just produced to the example paragraph on the previous slide, the instructions to the mark scheme in the preceding slides as well. use all of those to decide on a mark for yourself. Okay? Um, Hopefully there's no reason why you shouldn't be able to get it into that top band with all those resources to help you. And finally, if you can write your mark at the bottom of your work with a sentence explaining it, and if there's anything that you think that you need to work on, add that in as well. And then, of course, when you then send all this work in to me, I can actually look at what your view of it is, and I can see how well you understand the process as well. So we'll leave that there for the first half of this video, and on the second video I will pick up questions 3 and 4.